G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day, and so far you're having a brilliant weekend. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over, both tactically, strategically and politically, and fusing all of those together, because at the end of the day, war is a tool of politics and everything from tactics to strategy to operational success or failure and diplomacy, both the success and failures. It all goes into this holistic view of war that we need to have. So we're going to talk about more Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil facilities. We'll go a little bit further on that. We'll talk about ongoing issues around strategic level soldiers being moved to tactical level soldiers and how this is a form of defense. We'll look at the maps, we'll look at geolocations, we'll look at weapons being used. We'll talk about Zelensky talking more as a realist today about Ukraine's realistic prospect of military power and recovery of areas. And then we'll look at what Europe has said about a potential buffer zone and then what Zelensky has said about that. So a fair bit to go over. So let's start here with these refineries that have been getting smashed over the past couple of weeks as Ukraine has timed their campaign against these facilities in line with holidays in Russia and harvesting as well. And of course, there's more need for fuel. Now, the Krasnodar and Suzran oil refineries, they have been struck overnight. Now, I'm aware that many bloggers are repeating, and they have been for 3.5 years, that the Russian economy is on the precipice of an imminent collapse. And now, what the Wunderwaffen wasn't the F-16, it wasn't the Leopard, it wasn't the washing machines, it's now this. Now, what I'm saying is it may well be, but I'm definitely not, and all these others are definitely not the ones who would be able to see if this is going to be or not. That's why myself and Dr. Richard Connolly, who has been on this show for multiple times now, who's an economist, we will be speaking. We're emailing back and forth. We've done 2 podcasts previously. We're just struggling to find a time at the moment, but hopefully within the next week, we'll get a better idea of how will this actually look on the Russian economy. And from all my conversations with himself, and as well as reading things from RUSI and RAND and all these think tanks around this, we will see a slowdown in the Russian economy because it has been burning hot for the last couple of weeks. But as far as a collapse, that is highly unlikely with the fiscal nature and government reserves of this. But, of course, we'll go over that at length. Now, we see Mr. Serhiy Stenenko, of course, one of the best-known figures around drones and the Ukrainian right in this war. He has said this: after large-scale air attacks, we're recording new orders to reassign air defence specialists to infantry, including operators of interceptor drones. On one hand, we talk about how we are currently building up air defence. On the other hand, we're destroying the system. And this is against the backdrop of the ramp up in Shahed or Garan production. There are no words. We handed over interceptors to one of the air defence units, and there's already no one to operate them. And Tasaragami UA has spoken about this movement, and that reassigning air defence crews looks like self-sabotage. And I disagree. This is not command sabotage. This is what occurs when you have an acute shortage of manpower. That's no one but infantry can man a trench. And this is where the problem is becoming. That these systems, these air defence systems, are incredibly important. These intercepting drone teams are important. All of this is very important. But the most important in a ground war like this is, at the end of the day, the infantry in the frontline trenches to seize or hold or to retreat rearwards as well. And what we've seen is Ukraine very recently, they tried to defend an area with very little men, but do it by drones. And what we then saw was a 20-kilometre advancement in Zoloty Kolodiaz until there was a redeployment of men to stop that in its tracks, or at least attempt to stabilise it. So, as I've been saying over the past years, the best defence for Russia against Ukraine's high-end assets, it may not be then more high-end assets to counter this, it is attrition at the front. because these AD crews, eventually, if it's a choice between this guy being on this air defense system or no one at the front, militaries will have to choose someone at the front. It's only infantry who can seize and hold. Drones, air defense, cruise missiles, any of this, these increase the lethality of war and increase the lethality of defending or offending infantry combat corps. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the very fundamentals of war. Drone and the efficiency of drones actually reinforces the very fundamentals of modern warfare and why war is fought and how it is fought as well. So we will see more and more of that. And if I was a commander, sadly, if push comes to shove, you're going to have to do the same thing. Now, let's have a look at the maps, see where we're seeing some stuff move and a couple of geolocations too. So, of course, here's Ukraine, the center screen, the capital of Kyiv, red areas, occupied since 22, the purple since 14. If we put on these two arrows, we get red check indicating Russian confirmed advancement by Ukraine over the past 24 hours. This map has a lot of issues. This map is very behind in a lot of areas, but it is a fantastic baseline for what is being accepted while Russia is on the offensive. I was actually thinking the other day, if Ukraine went on the offensive, a good baseline would be what the confirmed is from Russia, because then we have a baseline of 100% confirmation because of the incentive for you not to confirm your enemy's advancement. So let's firstly come down in here. We see the Konstantinivka pocket. Now, some footage came out today that I think shows something that I've been speaking about for some time. So we have Konstantinivka, and I've got this just screenshot that I've done up right here. And at this Rozhenskoye right here, we see 7 kilometers back from the contact line, this then small town, this settlement outside of the larger Konstantinivka. And these smaller areas, what they do is it provides rest and rotation from the very zero line, casualty stabilization points before getting to higher care, logistics, of course, in and out, and cover, repeaters, antennas, everything for drone operators towards the front line. And this is the chaos that these FAB glide munitions are creating. Because in these areas within this distance, which these need to be from drones to CAS stabilization, all this needs to be sort of within this 10-kilometer distance, that drones are holding troops in here or providing ISR to spot the troops in here. Then FABs are destroying these areas and then using DRGs to further exploit what we see. And in here, this is a good example of this, is we see 2 Ukrainian gentlemen here come out of some cover out of these small buildings, and then they recover a larger quad-rotor drone. But then we see a zoom out on this, and we see multiple FAB 500s absolutely just leveling this area. And it's areas like this where these FABs are having the most amount of effect in that front line being used as a tactical battlefield weapon, as I say, as basically heavy artillery. And these drones, they're visualizing, seeing this, providing that information, and then putting then a weapon like that on target to break through where smaller drones may not be able to actually punch through anything that has been reinforced. But something we are seeing more and more over the past only 24 hours is actually Russian choppers in the air. Now, we see that this is the Liman direction up here. You can see that there has been some large Russian confirmed advancement on this front. Yesterday's video, I cast doubt over Suryak's map when he claimed that the Russian forces are on the outskirts of Seredny, which is right here, which by this map today does show that they're right on the outskirts of here, with some ballpark of 3.4 kilometers made in that direction, and in this direction, say close enough to 5 kilometers, being fairly conservative with the measurement. But in the Liman direction here, I'm seeing a lot of reporting through Ukrainian pages of there's a lot of Russian choppers working here. So in the morning, apparently a Kar-52 and Mi-8 were flying around 15 Ks from the very contact line here, which is still very close. And then 2 hours later, 3 more Kar-52 operating in here. Now, what we have got in the past 24 hours is a lot of LMUR footage, which is a guided missile off a Car 52, or primarily off a Car 52. Now, I had that geolocated by some guys, and it is down in Kherson, but there's a lot more footage than just has been geolocated, maybe operating up in here. Why? And someone asked me, Willie, why would you have a Car 52 putting that asset at risk rather than something like a glide bomb? And all this is for accuracy, time on target, realistically the kill chain. That if you are operating in a close air support role, CAS, you can't have Su-34s putting a bomb on target accurately enough, quickly enough to be close air support. The danger close of a Fab 500 is still a fairly long way away, and that these are a glide munition. But by the time you get on the blower, on the radio back, and hey, I need this here, it's going to take a long time. So from Su-25 to then the Car 52, these close air support, either fixed wing or rotary wing, this is supplying more of that. But of course, is putting the helicopter at further risk because it is closer to the line. But that is why we would see something like that more of an option over maybe like a Su-34. And a glide munition, as well as the ability to laser designate and more accurately, more precisely target. A Fab is a shotgun at the end of the day. Incredibly powerful, but you're leveling a lot. So I just thought that was worth looking at while we look at these areas of where Russia has been confirming to advance. And this is exactly what I've been saying, that if you're the command here, the risk for Russia was being vertically enveloped in here when it was very thin. They need to widen this. I see no point at all at this point in time of Russia moving any further west of Kharkivka. In the role of attritional war, leaving this open makes complete sense. And I've said Ukraine need to try and push it then east out of Kharkivka, but at the same time squeeze on it because Russia threatens being vertically enveloped. And what they should be doing by the doctrine is trying to fatten this, because by fattening this, you increase the amount of supply lines you can get in, therefore decreasing the amount of saturation of opposing assets, artillery, drones, etc. from Ukraine into here. Now, we know geolocated footage, Novomyalivka, there was a Russian troops in here yesterday, and then we see this today, so that is expanding. But of course, this is putting more and more pressure on this Liman area. So keep, as we've been saying for months, keep an eye on this front line. Now, let's move our way down into then Pokrovsk. And we do see a geolocation today of a Russian flag going up in Pokrovsk actual. So at this geolocation right here, just above Persho-Travnevia, as close as I could get it while still showing where we actually are on the map, we do see Russian guys with a flag here. So confirming definite grey zone up into here. Now, most maps that I am seeing, but not the ones we use because they're more speculative, are showing Pokrovsk is more like this at the moment, okay? It's hard to know. In my opinion, realistically, I'll just have this whole thing like this as grey zone if I was drawing the own map, given the DRG elements we have seen operating in so many areas in here. But it's just worth noting on this geolocation. Now let's move down into the Velika Novosilka front line. And we do see something today that should be in red check that has been horned in a little bit sneakily. Novoselivka. We spoke about this area yesterday, where we see from the day previously to yesterday this large advancement of grey zone up to Novoselivka, and then today we see red pop up in here as well as further grey. So we may now have the island boys of Kindrashivki, the island boys of Zolotokolodiaz, and the island boys of Novosilka. Now, some are saying that this is just a few houses occupied by the Russians in here. Maybe so. What I don't understand is I don't understand why Deep State would show it as red if it wasn't somewhat more than that. Because just being present in a couple of houses by anyone's metric does not mean that that's red. It means that it is grey. Red means you've got a foothold somewhere. So again, wait out on this, we will see, but you can see that grey has then further expanded as well. And I think this whole front line in here is generous with grey zone. So we can delete that one. But let's have a look at where Suryak is speaking about this, and he speaks about this front line of where we see then Voronezh is sitting and Ternove too, and he's actually just catching up on a few areas here that are around Voronezh, that it is in still grey zone but not under control of the Russian forces. You can see where the blue arrow is pushing, that Ukraine did push back in here, but more than growth in Ternove around Berezove areas as well. Then outflanking this Komashuvkia as well. And then we come up into then the northern area here. We have Zelensky and Tolstoy, areas you'll need to be familiar with. Zelensky is shown in grey zone on this map. He's showing that Ukraine has managed to push the Russians onto the eastern outskirts of here. We know there's been a bit of back and forward up there, as well as the recovery of Tolstoy by the Russian forces. As maps did show, Tolstoy was back under control of the Ukrainians, then under the Russians. So there's a lot of movement in here, and still this grey zone that if we take from Novoselivskia up here, there is grey zone protruding 16 kilometres into there. So continue down the maps into the southern region. Of course, we have Kamyanskaya and Plavne in here, an area we have seen some movement, minor, over the past couple of weeks. Last 4 days, Russian Army advanced northern part of Plavne, which is practically captured, is trying to enter Stepnohursk from this axis, as well as new positions taken. Kamyanskaya were retaken. So right up to then this green forested area, I believe, or maybe it's reservoir. It is reservoir right there of course, Dnieper River. So movement up to where that grey zone is, and potential movement further into Stepnohursk. So let's have a look over some other bits and pieces. And I think this is very telling today of something you and I have observed for some time. This was by the Kiev Post today. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia will never occupy Ukraine, but acknowledged that Kyiv currently cannot reclaim all its internationally recognised territories by military means. Zelensky said, "We all understand that today Ukraine cannot fully restore all its territories by force of arms. Sorry, Zelensky, but all the bloggers on YouTube know better than you. There's going to be an easy walk through Crimea. They don't have enough strength." They being the Russians. And we don't have enough strength. Therefore, when we talk about what society and people believe in, I consider that today the diplomatic path means fewer killings, fewer losses, and is a faster than the path of war. The path of war that we're on is years more, and the loss we have seen so far in this war will increase dramatically as the war goes on. But this shouldn't surprise anyone. You and I have been pointing out for a long time that Zelensky's once bellicose language against negotiation, discussion, or any concession was not only flat out denied, but it was also outright outlawed. But it was there was denial that any of that could ever happen. And now we have seen over the past 6 months, we've seen a huge softening on this, and that tells us a lot. But it would also be telling the Kremlin a lot also. Zelensky now admits what has been very obvious on the battlefield for some time. We know Ukraine cannot militarily reclaim its lost territories. We know that. Even using any sort of constant linear stretching of mathematics, it's not showing that. But when he says they don't have enough strength, they, referring to the opposing side, the enemy of Ukraine, Russia here, they don't have the strength. He's meaning of taking all of Ukraine, which, by what we've seen, is correct. But again, that's not the stated goal here either. By they don't have the strength, does Russia have the strength to secure the Donbass, as was proposed allegedly in Alaska and through what is claimed anyway? Well, even the linear warfare mouth breathers on the short bus would admit the answer is yes. What do I mean by they've admitted the answer is yes? By them saying in 4 years at this current rate and with this many losses, therefore they will take that. Now, all of those are mismeasurements absolutely at best. But what I've said is there is absolutely a reality where the war continues at this pace, at this very slow grinding pace, for 3 more years. That could happen. It's unlikely. It'll probably increase. But if it did, may this pace be able to actually be sustained? And if it can be sustained, then that will happen militarily. And this is what I've been saying. Along the scope of Ukraine's territorial goals, Russian's territorial goals, if you were to do what is more militarily achievable, is significantly closer to where Russia's is. But this tells us a lot more in here. Is the shift here is that Kyiv is no longer promising a total liberation, but instead pushing for guarantees, sanctions, the frozen Russian assets, and binding Western commitments, guarantees security, as well as politically and economically too. But this effectively places Ukraine's entire security in Western hands. The problem is, regardless of the rhetoric that these Western states are saying, they're not willing, obviously, to sign a treaty that risks automatic war with Russia, troops on the ground, and we see they're not willing to make a move without further US commitments either. That's the reality. That's the reality of what we see versus the rhetoric. Now, Merz and Macron and Callas and all these, they can say whatever they want, but have they been willing to actually sign a treaty that actually has effect? Have they been willing to move and make any real moves other than just some comments and meetings? No. And especially with the US sitting it out, we see that we're not willing to do this without the US, because Europe can't do it without the US because of the manufacturing, because of the pillars of sovereignty, etc. But he outlined Ukraine's 3 levels of security guarantees: maintaining a large Ukrainian army equipped with weapons from Ukraine, American, Europeans, agreements with NATO partners, ensuring readiness to support Ukraine in case of new Russian aggression, sanctions against Russia, and the use of those frozen assets. Now, what I will say is European leaders, they live permanently, it seems, in a self-made utopian dystopia that the leaders see, but I don't think many Europeans would actually agree with that that's what it has become. But they're detached from their own history, their own knowledge of war, knowledge of power. From Finland to Germany, these states literally wrote the fucking book on power politics and use of war. We see, obviously, the Finnish leader doesn't understand exactly how things operated. And, of course, the Chancellor now doesn't understand the Chancellors back in the day of Bismarck. But they pretend not to understand it. And then you'll see, this NATO-like being said. And I know there remains a language gap between Moscow and Brussels, but the Russians understand that NATO-like is de facto NATO. You're not shoehorning this in the back door by saying, oh, no, it's not NATO, it's de facto, it's NATO-like. It's the same Article 5 style, but no, we're not calling it NATO. I could change my name, but I'm still Willie. The problem of NATO, the problem that Russia sees with NATO, can't be solved by doubling down on NATO with pink bows on its hair and name something else. That's the problem. And that's why the war is likely going to continue fighting. To what conclusion, I don't know at this point. But at the end of the day, Zelensky is no longer talking about victory. He's talking more about survival. And that survival, it rests fully on Western life support for as long as the West is willing to keep paying. And we are seeing, I don't care what they say about it for however long it takes, whatever it takes, we are seeing further fractures grow in this. But there's 2 issues with all of this we see by a force, of strength, of blah, 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 is Russian politics and their command, they smell blood in the water. And if Zelensky's saying things like this, it's going to be even more difficult to get the Russians to stop fighting either if they smell that blood in the water. And the other thing is Ukraine's political lock-in. There's been a promise of full victory, of liberation, of prosperity within the EU and NATO for years. And this has not been forgotten by those families that have made so much sacrifice in the fighting. We don't know how that looks following. You could see the exact reverse of that too if there wasn't Russian occupation within the Russian forces, although I believe that will be significantly less due to how individuals may see that territory versus other territories, say like how Ukrainian soldiers see Donetsk versus how maybe Russians see it, and the amount of patriotism sitting there too. So there's been more talk about a buffer zone, and Politico had this, that grasping for straws. Europe floats Ukraine-Russia buffer zone in push for peace. European leaders are weighing the creation of a 40-kilometre buffer zone between Russian and Ukrainian front lines as part of a peace deal. We have heard about before, you step back 20, we'll step back 20, but again, it's going to get shot down because you're going to say, well, we're advancing. Why would we be stepping back? The proposal, according to 5 European diplomats, is among several that military and civilian officials considered for either a post-war or ceasefire scenario in Ukraine. Officials disagree on how deep the actual zone could be, and it's unclear Kyiv would accept the plan, as it would likely come with territorial concessions. And the US does not appear to be involved in the buffer zone discussions. Now, Zelensky today, he has shot this down, saying only those who do not understand the current state, the technological state in which the war is taking place today, propose a buffer zone of 40, 50, 60. I've even heard proposals of 100 kilometres. This is a completely different story. Today, with heavy weapons, are already located more than 10 kilometres apart from each other, because everything is targeted by drones. This is a buffer zone. I call it a dead zone. Some call it a grey zone. It already exists, or like the no man's land area. But what I will say is go back to what we spoke about in the beginning. Yes, this area of artillery does exist. It existed with artillery pieces back in many wars. And as I say, that drones, fabs, everything are just longer range artillery. But at the end of the day, where that line of control is still where there's a soldier in a trench or in a tree line or in a building. So it does still exist. And that's why the buffer zone, the proposal may have to go longer and longer and longer, as you say, because these weapons can then bridge that gap. Well, it's going to have to go outside of those artillery ranges. And this is why many people have said to freeze the line, and it's a buffer zone all the way to the Dnieper River. That's what I've heard many say for a long time. But the fact officials are toying with blocking off a strip of land inside Ukraine to force a fragile peace is indicative of NATO allies' desperation for a resolution to a war nearing its 4th year. And as this war goes in the trajectory we're seeing, I believe we'll see more and more grasping at straws or desperation. Jim Townsend, a former Pentagon official, he said they're grasping at straws. The Russians are not afraid of the Europeans, and they think that a couple of British and French observers are going to deter them from marching into Ukraine. Well, they're wrong. A petition is fraught with historical significance. European diplomats have stayed away from likening it to the heavily guarded divide between North and South Korea, and which are technically still fighting. They compare it to the division of Germany during the Cold War. But if you look at the scenarios run by JP Morgan, they put that the North-South Korea model may be far more likely. The number of service members needed to patrol the border also remains a concern. Officials are discussing from 4,000 to 6,000 troops. But countries have yet to make any commitments, and Trump is backed away from a potential US troop presence. NATO is struggling to prepare a response force of 300,000 troops to defend the alliance's eastern flank from future Russian attack. And any peacekeeping force would play dual roles, patrolling the DMZ while also training Ukrainian troops. Numbers are a huge problem. But at the end of the day, with this idea of tens and tens of thousands of troops entering, Putin won't stop that war for the de facto NATO of what we spoke about previously, regardless of what you are now calling it. Allies are holding off on making public troop commitments while they wait for key details, according to some European officials. Their questions include the rules of engagement for NATO troops on the front line, how to manage Russian escalation. They speak of rules of engagement here amongst Russian escalation, but you'd also need to consider the rules of engagement for Ukrainian servicemen members as well. That if you are setting, and you are the buffer zone, you are the peacekeepers, you are enforcing this. If the Russians put a mortar mortar down the spout of a tube, what's your ROE? But it's going to have to be enforced the other way too. If this Ukrainian group says, no, we'll continue fighting, what's the ROE there? And that's going to get messy quickly. That is why I see if there's any peacekeeping element deployed into here following this, it can't be from, it would be as ridiculous to be from Belarus into a DMZ as it would be from NATO. There's just not going to be acceptance of this. It would have to be a third party in this. How many third parties actually have the ability to do this? I think there's two, and both aren't perfect. There's China and there's India. Now, would India be interested with what is happening recently in their overall policy? I just don't believe so. China, I think the invitation of China into into Europe would have further worsened future consequence than having whoever else do it in there. But this is the thing, is the war here, the fundamental of war is to influence politics. And the politics that Russia was trying to influence is NATO not being in here. And that is why the war will continue if it's going to be NATO-like or troops on this border or whatever. And this is why many have said the front line is not going to be the border for this. It may end up where there's de facto de jure control, etc., but you're going to have the Dnieper because this is a physical line as a barrier between maybe what is protected and what is not. And again, we don't know where things are going to move into the future. It is a mess, and it is impossible diplomacy that you're trying to bridge a gap where there's just so much difference in outcome and what is acceptable outcome and proposal, where many have said the only way is going to be the surrender of one state or another at some point. Again, we don't know how this is going to look, but we'll be here to talk about it. For those unaware, Trump's ultimatums, some of these against Russia are expiring in the last few days, but I don't think anyone puts any weight on any of that anymore. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.